Good morning. I want to welcome you here. Before I do anything else, I want to ask you to silence your cell phones and to alert you that we're on C-SPAN, so we're all on our good behavior this morning. I'm David Smock. I'm a Senior Vice President here at USIP, and I also direct the Religion and Peacemaking Program. And it's my privilege to be welcoming you to this event jointly hosted and sponsored by USIP and the Office of International Religious Freedom at the Department of State. I'm also pleased to be able to introduce Ambassador Suzan Johnson-Cook, who will introduce this event. Ambassador Johnson-Cook is Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Prior to joining the State Department, she was Senior Pastor and CEO of the Bronx Christian Fellowship Baptist Church in New York. Earlier, she was a White House Fellow on the Domestic Policy Council. President Clinton appointed her to serve on the National Initiative on Peace. And in the 2 years she has served as Ambassador for International Religious Freedom, she's traveled to 5 continents to promote religious freedom. Ambassador?
Thank you, David, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today, a delight to be here at the United States Institute of Peace that does such great work in the world. I'm Suzan Johnson-Cook, as he said, the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, and I welcome and thank each and every one of you for being here with us today, including those who are tuned in online and on the air. I want to express certainly my appreciation and gratitude to you, our wonderful co-sponsors, the United States Institute of Peace, for hosting this event today, and to acknowledge Susan Hayward and David Smock for your hard work. We've been a team through these 2 years, and it's wonderful to continue with you and for your conceptualizing and coordinating today's event. I'm really pleased to be here to discuss civil society perspectives on religion, violence, and coexistence. Just back from the UN and presenting there also with civil society, it's really a topic that's of interest to us. And together with USIP, we've gathered a distinguished panel of experts who I have the pleasure of working with, who will address a critical set of issues that have tremendous impact not just on U.S. foreign policy, but on the way in which the world views religion and its role in societies all over the world. The internet release of the anti-Islamic film on YouTube, followed by the violence and protests around the world, serve as a stark reminder of the all too common relationship between religious extremism and violence, something we need to supersede with understanding, respect, and coexistence. But it also reminds us that there's more work to be done in terms of improving our understanding of religious dynamics and engagement with religious actors. The makeup of today's panel acknowledges that government officials cannot do this work alone. And we've been working together in partnerships and want to continue to do that. So we rely on consultations and these partnerships with civil society leaders and faith-based organizations to help us seek deeper analysis and more effective initiatives. And coming from the faith community, I can tell you how welcome that is. And today's conversation allows government to hear fresh perspectives from scholars, civil society leaders, how to preserve our fundamental freedoms while advancing at the same time peace, security, and coexistence. Thank you. And it also gives us opportunity to hear expert opinions on the role that the media plays in this arena. So we want to meet our panelists who are here today. We are delighted to have with us today's USIP's own Manal Omar. And make sure that I'm pronouncing it correct. Thank you. All right. Manal serves as the director of the Iraq, Iran, and North Africa programs under the Center for Post-Conflict Peace and Stability Operations. Ms. Omar was previously the regional program manager for the Middle East for Oxfam, Great Britain, where she responded to humanitarian crises in Palestine and Lebanon. She's also a key civil society voice on gender and peace building, and she's been recognized as one of the 500 most influential Muslims by the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. Woo! I got it? All right, give me 5. All right. Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. And I hear that Ms. Omar has also recently visited Libya and Tunisia, and I look forward to hearing your reflections on the work that's being done in these most important countries. Also joining us next to her is Professor Mark Gopin from the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University, who's been part of our working group, and he's a professor of world religions, diplomacy, and conflict resolution, and the director of the Center on World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution. Professor Gopin is also a subject matter expert on diplomacy with religious, political, and military figures. He's been working on religion and peacemaking in the Arab-Israeli conflict for more than 30 years. Also an expert on peacemaking strategies for complex conflicts in which religion and culture play a role. Recently, he worked with the Syrian and Afghan religious actors involved in peace building and conducts research on value dilemmas as they apply to international problems of globalization, clash of cultures, development, social justice, and conflict. I have been so fortunate to work with him as a part of the Religion and Working Foreign Policy Working Group, one of the 5 working groups that were established by Secretary Clinton's Strategic Dialogue with Civil Society. And so it's been a pleasure not to only have you as an expert, but to now have you as a partner and a friend. And lastly, we are joined by Hoda El-Shistaway. Oh, baby, I got it. Legislative and policy analyst for the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And we are thrilled, Hoda, that you have graciously stepped in for Harris Farron, who unfortunately could not be with us due to a family emergency. Hoda has completed her master's degree in ethics, peace, and global affairs, which focused on Islam, ethics, and conflict resolution from American University School of International Service. She also has experience working with programs involving dialogue development, interfaith cooperation, and conflict resolution. She served as a female Muslim ambassador to public schools and an interfaith initiative to highlight the commonalities of the Abrahamic faiths. Each of our panelists will provide opening remarks framing the issues of religion, violence, and coexistence through the context of their area of expertise, which will be followed by a question and answer session. And I'm looking forward to all that you have to contribute today and for all that we have to hear and share today. And last but not least, we are so thrilled to have Suzan Hayward from USIP, who will serve as the moderator for today's panel. And Ms. Hayward is a senior program officer in the Religion and Peacemaking Center of Innovation, where she develops conflict prevention, resolution, and reconciliation projects specifically targeting the religious sector. She also coordinates an initiative exploring the intersection of women, religion, conflict, and peace building in partnership with the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University. She works on the ground with religious actors involved in peace building in Burma, Colombia, Iraq, and Sri Lanka. So with that, you've met our distinguished panel. We are all eager to hear from them. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Suzan and our speakers again. David, thank you so much for hosting this, and thank you for having us here. We look forward to a wonderful morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Ambassador and to David Smock for opening us up here. We're very glad to have all of you here to the U.S. Institute of Peace here in the room and those who are watching us on the webcast. And as we are giving the presentations and launching off the moderated discussion up here after the presentations, I ask that if you have questions, you jot them down, because we will have an opportunity, as the Ambassador noted, to open up the dialogue to the audience, including the audience who is watching over the internet. And you can use the hashtag on Twitter, IRF@USIP, to give us your questions. So as the Ambassador noted, I'm a senior program officer in the Religion and Peacemaking program here at the Institute, which works to analyze and understand religious factors and conflict zones, and to work with religious actors to try to build just and sustainable peace and to transform religious drivers of violence. In places like Pakistan, Iraq, Sri Lanka, Burma, Nigeria, and Colombia, we work with religious and government institutions and civic organizations to transform religious drivers of violence, to deepen and extend interreligious coexistence, and to leverage the power of religious resources for the work of creating sustainable peace. We consider religious freedom to be an important aspect of our work. And I should note that one of the reasons that we're orienting this discussion about religion, violence, and peace building around issues of religious freedom is in part to mark International Religious Freedom Day, which is happening October 27th, later this week. In this sense, we are walking hand in foot with our State Department colleagues that see religious freedom as an inscribed legal norm, ensuring the protection of all people to practice their faith or their lack of faith openly and without fear of reprisal. We see this as important to creating peaceful and just societies. But we also know that the relationship between religion, violence, human rights, and peace is complicated because religions and societies are complicated and dynamic. After all, even the adoption of strong legal norms protecting religious freedom, such as we have here in the United States, does not guarantee that religious bias will cease to exist, that conflicts between religious groups will disappear, or that particular groups, often religious minorities, will not face social and structural discrimination, particularly when the human right of freedom of expression is fiercely protected, as it should be, up to and including the protection of speech that can drive religious violence, intolerance, and discrimination, as we saw in September. It's complicated, and many local communities and the global community struggle to chart the right course through this complicated fray. Our program, working where we are around the world, is painfully aware that in the turmoil and trauma that marks environments of violent conflict, and in nascent democracies and countries facing significant political turmoil or transition, religion's influence in shaping social attitudes and behaviors with respect to violence, governance, and attitudes towards other groups is often heightened. And of course, religion's heightened influence is not always for peaceful ends, particularly when media is added to a cocktail that can incite violence locally, but also across international borders in our increasingly shrinking world, again, as we witnessed in September 2012. Our program also knows from our experiences on the ground that in most cases, government and policy alone does not and cannot address religious dynamics that shape civil society. In fact, in many instances, civil society organizations may be those best positioned or suited to transform religious and social drivers of violence and discrimination, whether they're working independently or in partnership with governments seeking to strengthen religious freedom and coexistence. So for this reason, we're very glad to host this panel and to launch this discussion about the role civil society can and does play already around the world in fostering religious coexistence. We seek to highlight what may be little-known stories of religious and secular actors and institutions working together to knit diverse communities together. And we will seek to make recommendations about how to strengthen constructive civil society efforts to foster religious coexistence, about where and when these efforts can be done in partnership with governments and in intergovernment organizations. So we'll begin with the presentations, then open it up for discussion, and I'm going to ask that we start with Hoda and then make our way back up to us. So Hoda, with that.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. Thank you to the USIP and the State Department for putting on this incredibly important and very timely event. When we talk about religious freedom in 2012, we must view the issue through a 2012 lens. The international religious freedom community needs to shift its culture to a more nuanced understanding of how truly connected our globalized world has become, not just in terms of how we've streamlined reporting news to the masses, but also in terms of an ever-increasing pluralistic world. What happened in Benghazi, whether as a result of the amateur trailer Innocence of Muslims or not, was a wake-up call to the international community on the rights and responsibilities of our freedoms of religion and expression. The freedoms of expression and religion are not standalone issues. When discussing freedom of expression, we are inherently talking about expressing religion freely. When we, as the international religious freedom community, go out and engage civil society organizations abroad, we need to start the conversation by clarifying and understanding what free expression and religion mean to all. It's important to start with this mutual definition so that any miscommunication of these values are avoided. it's incumbent on governments and civil society organizations to start this dialogue of defining these freedoms as a starting point to beginning the difficult discussion how we uphold and support these values worldwide. Recently, our organization, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and Human Rights First released a statement condemning hate speech while protecting freedom of expression. And I have some copies here if anyone is interested. In this document, it's affirmed that hatred must be fought through non-legal means, through better speech and responsible speech. The problem lies when media chooses to highlight and promote sensational voices. When we lose or can't hear voices of the mainstream, we miss out on the bigger picture. Take, for example, the reports about the attack on the embassy in Benghazi. We were inundated with images of angry protesters surrounding the embassy, filling the streets with shouts and violence. But where were the reports of the Libyans who were carrying the ambassador and trying to protect him as they were taking him to a hospital? Where were the images of people around the Arab world who were mourning the loss of the ambassador while holding roses in his honor? When we miss out on hearing from mainstream voices, we lose the nuanced understanding of the situation. Now, I'm not denying the importance of a vibrant marketplace of ideas, but civil society needs to hold media accountable for highlighting only one extreme narrative. We've got to push back against the media's often one-sided portrayals and work to find mechanisms that give incentive to highlighting peaceful over sensational voices. There is a sincere effort to countering this kind of hateful narrative that seems to be getting so much attention. Civil society organizations such as the Muslim Public Affairs Council have been working on promoting religious coexistence through freedom of expression. After the release and subsequent reaction, very violent reaction and saddening reaction against the innocence of Muslims, MPAC released a series of YouTube videos in Arabic, English, Somali, Dari, Pashto, and Farsi, condemning the hateful message of the trailer and at the same time condemning the violent reactions to it. These videos featured leading American Muslim scholars, highlighting the examples of the Prophet Muhammad and how he handled hate speech. Between releasing the videos and now, in September and now, we've had over 1 million viewers of these videos. These YouTube videos show that civil society organizations can effectively use media, social media in this case, to promote peace and coexistence. Highlighting just this one example shows that civil society organizations can take ownership of supporting peace and religious pluralism by employing media. The videos are also a conversation starter. They go beyond the kumbaya moments and really delve into the deeper conversation and discussion of dealing with free speech, hate speech, and freedom of religion. When media, even undeliberately, foments religious bias and discrimination, the responsibility to push back falls on civil society and governments. There are plenty of challenges that arise when governments get involved, and there are plenty of opportunities as well. Governments must recognize that the old ways of advocating for religious freedom are outdated. Government-to-government diplomacy has got to be shifted to a more people-to-people diplomacy. And we've got to recognize that this paradigm reflects the times in which we live. When international religious freedom advocacy became popular in the late 80s, the focus was on certain persecution of minorities around the world. Today, the international religious freedom community should be promoting a more pluralistic theology of advocacy. International religious freedom communities have got to reflect the diversity of the world and therefore must be more pluralistic in nature, promoting and highlighting conversations that don't just affect Christians, Jews, and Muslims, but Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, whoever around the world. We're living in an increasingly borderless world. So when a young man lights himself on fire in the streets of Tunisia, it's not surprising when there are subsequent protests that come up in Egypt, Libya, or Yemen. The Arab Spring is just one example that highlighted the historically oppressive tyrannies of the Middle East and North Africa. The international community witnessed the correlation between the lack of freedom of expression and the oppressive nature of religious persecution on all communities and all groups. The Arab Spring was all about being able to express one's beliefs, whether politically, socially, economically, and religiously. Our government was kind of caught off guard with the revolutions, but it shouldn't have been. We need to be more aware and realize the direction our world is taking. The Arab Spring wasn't a government-inspired and organized movement. On the contrary, it was spearheaded and led by young people who utilized media to create change and strengthen the voice of civil society. Refreshingly, media coverage of the Arab Spring promoted mainstream voices and the synergy of all communities coming together to stand for peace, justice, and coexistence. So when we talk about opportunities and possibilities for engagement during a time like the Arab Spring and after, it is imperative that governments ensure that media and civil society organizations are included in those conversations. For too long, relevant religious institutions were ignored for engagement purposes. We as Americans are now learning their value to the conversation for upholding freedom of expression and religion. As long as we promote and develop a culture of diverse inclusion in these conversations, we might just find the answers we need to promoting religious freedom and coexistence through expression. So in terms of recommendations for the government or civil society organizations in moving forward to promoting international religious freedom and upholding free expression, I would stress that we use our position and we use the government's position to play the role of the convener and facilitate conversations and discussions just like this to strengthen the voices of civil society organizations and those who are working to champion these positive values. Let's be honest, at the end of the day, we've had 1 million innocents of Muslims before, and we'll probably be seeing many more to come. But it's now is the time for us to be working together, and this is the first step in that positive direction to overcoming hate speech and using our freedoms to counter that hate speech. Thank you.
It's also a pleasure for me to be here, to be speaking with you, and to be working with Ambassador Suzan and David and Suzan. These are my favorite people in Washington, and it's a thrill to be here. Well, I just want to reflect a little bit on where we're going in terms of our practice in civil society on a global scale, and where some of the research is indicating where and when human society is proning towards and moving towards nonviolence, and where things get worse, where things get better, and just to put all those pieces together in terms of our experience in the field. I've been involved in many conflict management situations over the years that involved religious incidents of intolerance or expressions of outrage over something that occurred. And one of the things that is interesting and a question in our lives is when is an incident something that's transformative and that creates a massive outbreak of response, and when is it something that looks just peculiar? Like why are there incidents that look like they're central and they change all the relationships and are very destructive, and other times it looks like it's just a kook, it's just somebody who's violated the law or done something outrageous, and you move on? Because it's very important to analyze the substructures of the relationships between people. What is their unwritten social contract? What are the binders that bring people together or tear them apart? Because in knowing that and in building on that, which is the basis of civil society work, but also the rule of law, then you see whether an incident is going to create a crisis or an incident is just the peculiarity of one person. I mean, when you compare the peculiarity of the person who made this film, who ends up being, having this record and just a completely irrelevant, strange character in American society, and then think about what it effectively symbolized in global relations between the United States, the West, and the Islamic world, what an absurd tragedy. A comic strip couldn't have done better in terms of thinking about the origins of the film and then the consequences. Well, what's missing? What's missing is a social contract. What's missing is the hard work that people build together that, as Hoda just said, in a global community is absolutely essential to be done globally. And without that social contract, everything becomes a symbol of adversarialism. And so the real question, like for example, and you just take it out of your context sometimes, is that there are Indian villages in India where there were terrible outbreaks of violence in the 1970s and the 1980s and so on, but really going back. And those villages got attention, got international attention. Everybody knew about those riots, and it was a symbol of the Hindu-Muslim confrontation. Because it really is one of the biggest Muslim countries in the world and the biggest Hindu country in the world. You know, 1 billion people, 300 million though Muslims. And so those incidents were front and center. Little known was the thousands of villages where actually Hindus and Muslims celebrate each other's rituals. That's also India. But it didn't get on the news. Because the media does crave drama. Human beings crave drama. Going back thousands of years, even before radio and television, people love drama. The great binders of society, the people who created the social contracts that moved beyond sectarianism, that moved beyond religious differences, the Martin Luther Kings, the Gandhis, they understood that either you create those bonds or somebody is going to create the incidents to tear those bonds apart. Because there's great political power. There's even great military power and monetary power in building on hatred. It's a great moneymaker. It's not just the media. The media likes drama. But the real issue is that you can build your political societies on the hatred of the other, or you can build it on more pragmatic things like better wages or better health care. And every society in the world is struggling with the question and this choice. Every politician, am I going to build my Nigerian political career on anti-Islamism, or am I going to build it on making a wealthy middle class? Everyone faces that choice. And the key for civil society, particularly religiously inspired groups in civil society around the world, and all of my friends from Nigeria to Syria to other places, was how are they going to utilize their power as civil society people to create the social contract, the unwritten social contract between groups that makes these kind of incidents into exceptions, into embarrassing exceptions, not opportunities for unscrupulous politicians or others to use that to build their power base. That's the choice. And it's the question for the United States government, for the West, for every government in the Muslim and the Arab world is, are they going to invest in civil society that specifically builds that kind of social contract? Or are they going to act as if, no, we'll just repress it all? We're just going to ignore religious identity. I'll never forget, I worked in Syria for 7 years with amazing people, Shiite, Sunni, Christian, Alawite. We were all together in our interfaith work. And we outsmarted the regime. We were so nonviolent, we were so non-threatening, we were nice to everyone, and we got on television every single time with these panels that represented Alawite and Sunni and Shiite and atheist and everybody together, women and men, so that in every family in Syria, at least for one bit of their television, they saw a model of interfaith coexistence. And now we're trying to pick up the pieces because of so many forces that came to work to tear them apart, to put them at each other's throats for the sake of maintaining a police state. Because this is the danger of religious identity, is that it is easily utilized by politicians and militaries and intelligence agencies to destroy people and control people. I work with Pakistanis who are facing incredible difficulties of the legacy of the Cold War, where my government and other governments in the region specifically pitted Sunnis against Shia for the purposes of political gain. And now they're trying to pick up the pieces from disastrous, unscrupulous criminal activities. And look at the difference between the targeting and the killing, almost the killing of this poor little girl who wanted an education, and the thousands of Pakistanis who come out on the street to demonstrate in solidarity with her. Now those people, they were disciples of Gandhi and King. They were disciples of Ghaffar Khan. because they understood that if media and drama is the stage on which all of this is played out, then you have to get better at that stage. If the symbols of hatred are sources of power for some in the world, then you have to create the symbols of solidarity and love. And you have to do it often. You have to put it in people's face. You have to have interfaith councils in public all the time with the sheikhs and the priests and the others saying exactly the same thing, that love and honor and dignity of both men and women is at the core of our religious beliefs. And people have to see that as the authority. Then when a crazy person comes along and does something else, they just see it as crazy. They don't see it as authority. In addition, what we've discovered in the field, and we weren't able to do this in Syria, but we've tried in other places, more doing this in Israel, Palestine, is that at a certain point of interfaith dialogue and social contracts, people get tired of words. If they're living miserably, if they're poor, and they see that, oh, all of this particular group, they have all the money and we don't, then they're not so crazy about words about love and peace and justice when they don't see the evidence. So what you have to do further is something that's difficult bureaucratically for governments. You have to combine humanitarian investment and interfaith and peacemaking. You have to bring help and jobs and empowerment to people as Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Hindus. You have to see, people have to see that this is a joint effort. People have to see that you're investing in their families. And that starts to make a difference. This is what Gandhi understood. This is what Martin Luther King understood. And this is what many activists, my friends from Nigeria, everywhere you go, the imam and the pastor in Nigeria, you go to Gaza with Sheikh Bukhari and Eliyahu, you go many places. It starts out with important symbols, like a big hug of Jerusalem. They had no budget, but they managed to get 1,000 people to hug around Jerusalem, and it made a difference. You know, it made a difference. You know, they surrounded Jerusalem with a hug. It was a brilliant idea. But when the Gaza war happened, it went further. It went to secretly smuggling food into Gaza, as Jews and Arabs together. And that made a difference to those families. When somebody decided to do something with a pig's head and Muhammad in Hebron, one of the radicals in Israel, and there was already a prior existing relationship between a major rabbi in Israel and major sheikhs in Palestine. Immediately they're on the phone together, and they got a chief rabbi to condemn that activity, and that prevented a riot, it prevented the violence. So again, there was an unwritten social contract between leading people, and they could contain the violence. And a final key aspect to this, and we're seeing a great deal of research from Steven Pinker and from others, the growth of relational empathy and sympathy, the vital nature of people coming to know each other and feel sympathy for each other, the vital nature of gentle commerce, of people doing business together and growing wealthy together, the vital nature of the rule of law, but the Western constructs and the government constructs getting used to the fact that the rule of law is not just the rule of law, it's also the rule of religious law. So that people come to know that there are rabbis saying that this is illegal, to do this to this person, and this fatwa says it's specifically against that kind of terrorism. That too is the establishment of social norms and decency that in history becomes a solid foundation for the social contract that then again makes incitement to violence of a film or of this, of that, into a strange, sometimes criminal activity. It takes a lot of empathy to understand that in many cultures, insulting a prophet is the same as somebody defecating on the American flag, or somebody doing something that's an incitement. You know, we're struggling in the United States with, I don't know which group it is that when the soldiers were coming home did something horrible at the funerals. It was a radical Christian group. I don't know what the name of it is. But really it tested this notion of freedom of speech. And we're sitting here, we're tearing our hair out with what do you do with that? How much more can you injure somebody that ended a funeral for their child? So we all have our symbols in places where, how could you even go there? And yet, the more empathy we have, the more we come to know each other. We know those spaces of pain, and then we work together because we already have a prior existing relationship to not let people divide us on those insulting and horrible incidents, but on the contrary, to bring us together. So that when somebody makes an outrageous statement in the New York subway system about jihad and Muslims, then on the contrary, you invest in a counter-advertisement. And that becomes the more important symbol. And you get right in there because you had the relationships. That's what we're seeing civil society is strong at.
I'm going to apologize ahead of time because my views on this are often, contradictory in many ways. I spend a lot of time actually debating myself in terms of what's the best way forward. And one of the things I thought I'd start with was, my recent trip. Before I ended in Tunisia and Libya, I actually started in Malaysia and then went to Dubai and then ended in Tunisia and Libya. And it was very interesting to see, although all Muslim countries, the reaction to the film was very different. In Malaysia, the youth really, kept telling me statements like, well, the Prophet's, steps speak for itself. There's no reason for us to defend it. In fact, the thing that most of the youth were showing me was something called KL Style, which is a parody of the song Gangnam Style, and that's what they were more interested in on YouTube than the video itself. In Dubai, very much like among the American Muslim community, there was a lot of intellectual deconstructing of the video. How can we put, our own YouTubes out? How can we, be able to be proactive? And naturally, as we saw in Libya and Tunisia, it was much more passionate and much more defensive. And I think that one of the things that we forgot in the debate is we were talking about transitional countries that have been through trauma and who've been, who are severely destabilized. And really at the root of the conversations was the question of everything has been stripped away. We're trying to rebuild our, nation, and the last thing that we have is our dignity. I mean, the Arab Spring or the, revolutions in each country brought us dignity, and this video hit us there. It hit us and made us feel humiliated, and everyone was speaking about protecting the right to speak, but no one was about protecting the, right of, religion and our own identity. And I think at the root in a lot of the countries that have been through the revolutions is the question of identity, and religion is very much intertwined there. I think the other element is it's not just a question of an international debate, but it's very much an internal debate. A lot of people are asking, where is religion going to fall in the Constitution in a very pragmatic sense? Where does it fall in defining, myself as a Tunisian or myself as a Libyan, myself as an Egyptian? And so with the video enhancing a lot of those or inflaming a lot of those discussions that were happening internally, what you saw was a reaction that then took on into a global scale. I actually learned about the Benghazi attacks from my Libyan colleagues who called me very early in the morning to apologize and who were really, frightened. Some of them had actually participated in the protests, and they said, we went to the protest completely not expecting any violence of any sort, and we were horrified to see where it came. And, we really want you, obviously I was based in Washington. I was in Washington at the time. We want you to make sure people understand this is not Libyans. This is not Islam. We never expect that. We respect Ambassador Stevens. And as you know, and many people heard, and I personally worked with him when he was a U.S. envoy, he was very much respected and loved within Libya. But the question remains, why the violence? Not only, of course, in Libya, we saw in Yemen and Tunisia. And again, I keep emphasizing the issue of destabilized and traumatized nations. I think that the element of how to work with the groups who are trying to come back and address the issues of identity and understanding that right now on the ground, this is one of the biggest issues civil society is really trying to come together with. In most cases, there is an assumption in order to receive funding or to be accepted by Western nations, you have to distance yourself from religion. I think the exception has been in Libya, where you've seen some groups step out. In particular, there's the Free Ulama Network that's you know, a network of some of the most respected ulama in Libya who have been very active, at least in terms of issuing statements. And this isn't just recently, even after the revolution in March 8th, 2011, the Free Ulama Network issued a statement to promote international women's rights. So, you know, here is a country in the midst of, you know, a revolution for freedom, and they took a step to say, you know, as ulama, as religious leaders, we respect women's rights and we respect women's role in the revolution. So you saw that there was a voice trying to break through the mainstream, and they also recently issued a statement about the attack in Benghazi. But they are the exception. I mean, where religious and civil society have come, you know, well together, and some people would debate, you know, how productive this has been, but in terms of development, you've seen a lot of religious institutions in the Middle East who are able to go into humanitarian and development work. Very rarely will they actually go into the concepts of human rights, or more specifically when you're talking about religious freedom, because it is a difficult issue to address. So the question that I wanted to talk about is if there's this understanding, and there currently is, that anything to do with religion will not be seen as civil society. Therefore, you're seeing a lot of organizations, you know, scrubbing any language related to faith. You know, what is the results that that's had on the ground? Two things have happened. One is it delegitimizes these groups, because they're not able to connect with the grassroots. They're not able to connect with the youth who, you know, first response is to connect with things that relate to their faith. The other element is it's forced a lot of the mainstream who are practicing and who don't want to go towards just a secular language to then result towards other groups who might not necessarily represent their vision in terms of nation building. So they'll speak of faith, but they're not necessarily the same organizations that they would want to have represent them. And so when I was in Tunisia more recently, I sat with a group of young people who had just been trained in conflict resolution, and they were saying that if they were to choose, they actually feel closer to the secular organizations that are based in Tunis than to any other organization. But because these secular groups reject them directly because they're practicing, have beards or wear hijab, or reject the use of Islam or using Islamic references, they're not welcomed within that group. And so by that exclusion, they tend to go to some of the more extreme groups. So it's not necessarily a choice as much as that the polarization that's going on in the country is forcing people to choose sides. Whereas if we're able to really integrate the use of faith and religion in the elements that Mark and Huda are talking about, particularly in terms of peacemaking, then you'll find that the majority of people in the country want to find that avenue and that area for participation. The biggest issue that really is, coming on top is that divide between the secular and the religious, and the framework is one of the things that people are emphasizing more than the principles or the outcome. One of the things I wanted to talk about is how to try and overcome that divide. Particularly, Huda had mentioned the role of the governments and the international community in convening, and I think that that's where an ironic opportunity has opened, is that both groups don't trust each other internally within the country, and they are looking for the international community and are asking for groups to convene so that this discussion can take place. It's very clear that nation building will not be effective until that issue is addressed. And some of the issues is really coming in terms of engaging and supporting, not only by bringing them to the table, but by providing them with tools, the religious leaders. And I say this in terms of partnerships. A lot of programs that target religious leaders already are targeting them as audiences or as participants. So they'll bring them into the room and they'll tell them, this is what Islam says, or this is how Islam deals with freedom of religion, this is how Islam deals with women. And that is not going to have the same effect of really partnering with the religious leaders to find a way to make sure that the message is heard through the grassroots. I think the other thing is recognizing, being wary of the political agendas that tie. For example, with Benghazi, the incident was horrific, and there was a very strong call internationally and locally for action to take place. So, you saw civil society organizations on the street immediately protesting the violence. A lot of memorials being held for Ambassador Stevens in Benghazi same day. So people felt that need to take action. But that somehow got bridged to a political agenda of let's get rid of the militias in Libya. And I think it's very important that we're cautious that the issues issues at hand are addressed directly and not overcome by politically. That slowly expanded to where the incident in Benghazi is now justifying or being used for what's going on in Beni Walid. Two very separate incidences. You then had civil society activists and very well-intentioned, so eager to show the West and to show their own country that the extremisms were a minority, that they forced them out of Benghazi. So in order to show that, extremism and violence wasn't welcomed, they used violence to get rid of them. So, an ends justifying the means attitude. And I think it's very important that the international community and the religious leaders are particularly saying, let's take a step back and see how our approach is different than other approaches, so that the message in itself doesn't get lost and it's not a matter of the ends justifying the means. In order to do that, and I think in order to be an honest convener, that we need to address our own issues domestically, and to really sit and talk about extremism from within, and talk about the video, how it was made, but the statistics, the surveys show a rise in Islamophobia, and I think unless we're really willing to say that there has been, for political reasons of our own, for other agendas, there has been a rise, there has been a targeting. It is an issue that needs to be addressed. There are extremisms within our own midst. That will then, and even just the simple acknowledgement, give the legitimacy that the United States and Western countries are willing to address the issue internally as much as they're willing to hold other nations accountable. I think just over the weekend there was an attack in France on a mosque to express concern over the rise of debates over Islamic law. Again, the use of violence to prove a fear of the unknown. And I think that until we're willing to really address this issue, we ourselves lose legitimacy as the possible conveners. I think the other final thing that I wanted to say is understanding that a lot of times the concepts themselves are acceptable, but what it looks like is very hard on the ground. And nothing demonstrates this better in my mind than freedom of religion. I was actually telling Susie this morning, I was surprised at how much of an issue it was while I was in Tunisia. The very idea of within the Constitution, do you have a clause that allows for freedom of religion? And so, when you ask people personally, what do you think? Everyone says, of course, this is natural. Islamically in the Quran, there's an ayah that says, La ikraha bid-din, no compulsion in religion. But when you talk about actually putting it in the Constitution, people will say we can't. Well, if you believe it, why can't you? So again, the concept is acceptable, but the actual mechanism is very controversial. And I think it's very important that we ourselves focus on approach, because if there's an insistence that you put it in, then it becomes something that's difficult to implement. And without building the proper foundations, without having the proper dialogue, and working with the community so that they understand that it's not only something that's being required because of international conventions, it's rooted within an Islamic framework, but it's necessary for the nation building process. What will happen is that the groups that we push to implement will then be rejected by their communities. And I think that's the greatest fear of all, particularly now with the Arab Spring establishing, the idea of a group leadership by taking the streets. There has to be mechanisms that are built-in tools for people to express that concern and that anger, to the point where then when you do implement within the Constitution or within any legal framework the issue of freedom of religion, it's understood, it's accepted, and what it looks like is agreed upon.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. That was a great launching off to our discussion, and I think some of the themes that came through particularly strongly for me were, one, the potential and the ways in which different organizations are trying to use the potential of social media to foster religious coexistence and to foster some of these local and global dialogues on some of these issues, but the need to strengthen some of those initiatives, and as Mark pointed out, the need to develop this craving for the drama of interreligious peace building and the alternative peaceful religious voices, as much as there is that craving for the drama of religious violence or instances of religious conflict. But again, as I think came out in all of the presenters' talks, it's very complicated, and even within each of these religions and each of these contexts, there's a great deal of pluralism, there's a great deal of contestation within the religious sector, also within the political sector. And so entering into those conversations and seeking to support civil society organizations and religious organizations in a constructive way is always something that needs to be done very carefully and with as much listening as there is talking and cajoling. And so one question I do want to throw out at the beginning is one that we often receive at USIP working with religious organizations overseas, which is that the how. How can international organizations, in particular Western organizations and governmental or quasi-governmental organizations, work with religious organizations and actors and sectors overseas in a way that you will not delegitimate the very authority and legitimacy that religious actors and institutions have within their society? Because we know that in working with particularly Western organizations, that can sometimes paint religious actors and institutions in a particular way as untrustworthy, as opportunistic, and so on. So I wonder what you would have to say from your observations on the ground about examples of how this work has been done effectively by outside organizations to support religious leaders in a way that won't undermine them.
I mean, I think that the key issue is finding organizations that already have the legitimacy and then exactly providing them that support. One of the challenges has been networks that have been formed or groups that have been formed have often not necessarily been supported as much as created by Western organizations. So understanding that distinction is particularly important. I think especially depending on the language being used in country. I was very surprised in Tunisia when the majority of participants came up to me to tell me this was the first time the training on conflict resolution had taken place in Arabic. So everything that had been done for the groups, at least that I was talking to, had been done in French and in English. And so, the absorption capacity is much weaker. So, understanding that you support existing groups. And I think the other issue is the capacity building, but bringing in more of the convening role of South-to-South leadership. So, I think that's the other element, is how can you connect them, even contexts that may not seem to have anything in relation. For example, the stories you were saying from India, examples from Sri Lanka, like how can you connect for more South-to-South learning rather than just, this is what we've done in the West, this is how it works in the West, this is what we see in the U.S., and this is, why we're able to differentiate between freedom of speech and freedom of religion. For a lot of people don't simply cannot relate. They see the West as a very different society. So the more you can bring in the South-to-South learning from people who've actually been through it in recent history, I think the more traction you'll be able to have with the message.
The other thing to add is that I simply think there's a long history in human interactions globally, well beyond governments, of philanthropy being something quiet. In other words, I think that there's a long history of the effectiveness of philanthropists and private donors being people who are quiet because they want the work to be prominent, not their presence. And that's an issue for many people in governments. They want to be acknowledged. They want people to see that this is our activity. Well, there's a good place and a space for public diplomacy that governments do. It's very important work that governments can do when they do public diplomacy. But helping civil society is not necessarily one of them. That's where it may be better to be quiet and respectful and to not overemphasize your presence. And I think it's been my experience among the various European governments and others that I've worked with, is that the quieter the ambassador is, the more he becomes a very trusted partner. I don't mean American ambassadors, other ambassadors in the world. Because they're serious. Their quietness almost demonstrates their seriousness. I was in relationship to a Swiss ambassador in Syria, and literally I was afraid for my life half the time, and I didn't know, because I have Jewish origin, and I'm in a police state, and they're a severe enemy with Israel, and I was always a little bit worried, but it turned out I was mostly paranoid. It was Syrians that were in danger, not me. But I was afraid, and this Swiss ambassador made me feel comfortable all the time. He didn't even tell me how many other things that they were doing. They were doing many things to try and improve civil society, to try and help people. And they just were quiet about every activity. And that's great diplomacy. And that's great effectiveness of a government. So I think that quietness and respect and enabling and making prominent the voices in that space. And like Manal said, you identify this amazing woman in Afghanistan who's already running extraordinary programs for women and educational programs and working creatively with imams, then you get in there and you support her. But you don't ruin her reputation by making people think she's a tool of somebody else. You empower her. I also have to say that one of the things that the Western governments can do better, or the local governments too, is that there's an interesting thing that Manal raised that I realized, and that is that where we glorify civil society, but there's a problem with civil society, and that is that NGOs tend to be oriented towards ideological constructs. They're funded by people who are ideologues. Sometimes they're religious ideologues, sometimes they're anti-religious ideologues. And what you get, I bring classes to Palestine. I bring classes, my graduate courses, and we do public diplomacy intervention through my classes. And we're in Egypt last year, and the sort of communist group comes in, and they hate the religious people, and they have an intention of what they're going to do with society, and they speak to my class. Then the religious militant comes in, and he says, what's your agenda? Revenge. Revenge. We're gonna get them. And you can see, the makings of what's going to be a very difficult affair. There needs to be a conscious cultivation of interfaith communities and of secular religious alliances for poverty, for women, for health care, for jobs that are specifically binding of people together. And that creates almost a new notion of religiosity and secularism. And that's where I fully support what you were saying, is that this is where we find, from Syria to Palestine to many places, that's what most religious people actually want. They want a safe space for their families, a prosperous space. They don't need religion to be militant, but they don't need secular people to insult them either. And that we can be helpful in encouraging those kind of spaces.
Manal, I want to go back to something that you said in your presentation and that we discussed a little bit over bagels this morning, which was the sensitivity of religious freedom as a policy in some of the contexts in which you work. And what you said about it might not be something that can be written into the Constitution at this point, but this can be something that is dialogued about with civil society and nurtured as a foundation on which laws can be established later. But there's a little bit of a cart and horse problem here, because there's a lot of fears amongst some that if you don't have it written into the Constitution at this point, then it might be something that is never established in law down the road. And so how would you respond to those concerns?
No, thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify. I mean, I think that you would have to find a way to write it into the Constitution, the same way that I feel that you would have to find ways to write protection of women's issues and minorities' issues into the Constitution. I think the idea is not to give it as a given. The concept in itself, when you say women's rights, when you say religious freedom, when you talk about minorities' rights, everyone as an individual agrees. It's what it will look like that begins to divide people. And so unless you have the full conversation, people will reject it within the Constitution. And I think that most of the countries that we're talking about, the transition process is very quick. I mean, we look at South Africa, it took them 8 years to write their constitution. We look at Libya, they had an 8-month roadmap. They're looking at 18 months to actually complete it. Tunisia, theoretically thinks they're done. I think they're actually going to press the reset button and have to start all over next week. But theoretically, they think they're done on the Constitution. I mean, this was very quick processes. So none of those dialogues took place. What will happen, for example, in the case of Tunisia, is if it goes to a referendum, people will vote no. No one understands why religious freedom has been introduced in the Constitution. All they understand is that if a Muslim decides to stop being a Muslim, then the government of Tunisia will sanction and support it. That's the limit of the conversation. They're not understanding the full wide range of what the religious freedom would look like. Similarly with women's rights, but I think that's the danger. And so when you put that position, and then again in a system where you're going to referendum, you're putting yes or no, everyone, and I guarantee this is the same debate that we had in Iraq over and over, when Iraqis themselves, particularly the secular organizations, would say, the conversations you're trying to have belong in Tehran, they belong in Riyadh, they don't belong in Baghdad. I hear that over and over in Cairo and Tunis. In fact, they do belong because people need to understand the full breadth of the conversation. When you come, you'll always lose. And you can't have secular law versus religious law. It's a lose-lose situation. But when you actually deconstruct it and you're actually able to say, this is the whole breadth of religious freedom, and it actually protects you to choose your own interpretation. It actually protects you to be able to follow your religious imam. It actually protects you as a Christian minority. It actually and people understand what it means to their daily life. I think then it becomes acceptable within the Constitution. But how it's being presented now is international conventions require it. U.S. will not support you. You will not get funding, even if that's not true. I mean, no one has to make that statement. That's how people on the ground understand it. And so there's an immediate rejection of it, although everyone agrees with the concept.
And I would just add here, I'm probably breaking the rules now by adding my own input, but I would just add that from some of the conflict contexts in which I work, not just in the Muslim world, but in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, the elephant in the room in these discussions is always proselytizing. And the negative role that some groups have played, particularly Christian groups, in tying conversion to development and humanitarian assistance. And so religious freedom, often in negative ways, gets associated with the activities of some of these groups, and that's what creates some of the sensitivity to these discussions as well, and that needs to be part of the larger dialogue and discussion with these groups.
I mean, I think the other role that would be, there is a tendency of Western constructs to be very narrow and saying this is either the legitimate form of rights or it's not, and that's not the way that this played out historically in all the different countries that have experimented with human rights and democracy. People come up with their own formulas in the end that are a move forward but are not necessarily your move. So, for example, I'd love to see a struggle for the right to interpret, freedom of interpretation, which may not be the same as freedom of religion. I mean, people have to struggle with the language because people worked on this for hundreds of years of what rights meant to them and how it worked in their societies. And there are still major differences between Germany and the United States on Nazi symbols, for example. What's that all about? So we have this radical notion of freedom of symbols here that Germany decided, no, that's beyond the pale. Okay. You know, you could say, do they not have rights there, free speech, because they've decided that Nazi symbols are beyond the pale? No. They've had their interpretations. And this is where we should encourage a great deal of legal creativity between religious and secular people to arrive at the most nonviolent possibilities.
I mean, I was just going to say, Mark and Manal both hit the nail on the head in terms of when it comes especially to writing the Constitution, it's imperative, I think, to define these terms. What exactly does it mean for freedom of religion? And rather than it being sort of a negative thing that it will hold you back from this, and this, it will protect you as a minority. It will protect you as a woman. It will protect you as a part of the majority. And unfortunately, we live in a world where perception becomes reality. And so when you do have this idea that if you don't vote yes on religious freedom, then you won't get certain funding, then that's where the problem lies. But it is important, I think, for civil society to be engaged in these conversations with government when they're writing these constitutions to help define and to make the definition broader so that all groups and all communities are included.
One more question from me, and I'm actually building off of a Twitter question that came in earlier, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you, so prepare yourselves, people. And that question goes back to something actually you mentioned, Mark, about atheists being part of the conversation in Syria. And the question that came in from Twitter is, how can outside organizations also help mediate or moderate the discussions between non-believers or those who don't affiliate themselves with affiliate themselves outside of faith communities or religious communities, which we know is a very contentious issue in much of the world. So what did it look like? What was the texture of the conversations, and how did you create the space for atheists to be a part of the interfaith conversation in Syria?
Yeah, that was all public displays of what I call a social contract are based on prior relationships. So you cannot discount the fact that there are specific people with talents, the great connectors that are talked about in social network theory, who have already those relationships with believers and non-believers and etc. And they're the ones that convene in such a way that makes it possible for people to come together and have some good arguments. And good argument. In fact, much of our work in Syria was framed as the spirit of debate, or the role of public debate, because the idea was, I'll never forget an official telling me, we have no religious conflict here in Syria, and and I said, oh boy, let's wait, and this was a year before everything broke up. So the idea of debate is actually the non-violent engagement in conflict, if you think about it, and we wanted to model what debate was that was non-violent. This is especially important for men. I mean, we know that globally, the more that women are involved in leadership, the less violence there is. One of the issues with men and violence is the difficulty with debate nonviolently, the expressing differences in public without the use of anger or force, etc. So that's what we were modeling, and it was a more angry debate when it was, atheists versus the others, because non-believers everywhere feel deeply threatened by the organized nature of religiosity, and they're very afraid for their future. So it gets very angry. But if you moderate, but I couldn't as an outsider. I was just a guest. I was just the guy representing Judaism. That's all. I happened to be from the outside, but I was almost like a Syrian Jew at that moment. So it was an interesting role, but I was not there to moderate this society's issues between believers and non-believers. That would have been totally inappropriate, just to clarify.
I could just add, I think that what's really inspirational is that the younger generations have acknowledged the fault of polarization within their parents' generation. So you have a lot of that happening naturally. For example, a group of young activists who would probably be defined as secular, but much more approachable than their mother's generation, which actually have in their bylaws, if you wear hijab, you cannot be a member, for example, of a feminist organization. Was talking about how she's very interested in reaching out to the more conservative. And I asked her why, and she said, well, she was sitting in her final examination in college when two of her friends, not necessarily good friends, but two friends who were wearing the scarf, the teachers had come up to them and said, you must take off your scarf or leave. And basically their entire, school was in jeopardy, and so they decided to leave because they felt that they were under this moral kind of, road, and that they couldn't do that. And so, as a secularist and raised in a secular home, she was more concerned about these two girls were just denied education. And so if there was any hope of them, even if, the scarf is oppressive, if there was any hope of them ever having a chance in the future, it was for them to complete their degrees. And so she couldn't understand the logic. And I think you're seeing that more, and it's what I call focusing on the principles. The framework, religious or or secular, is not what's relevant. It's the principles, and I think you can really unite people around the principles. Right to education, right, to the basic rights will bring people together. Another story is a group of young Egyptians who started a YouTube campaign, and it basically shows the breakdown of communication. One of my favorite videos is this, communist secular person goes to visit one of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so he says, well, what will you want to drink? And so they show like bubbles of them both thinking, and this person's like, I can't ask for a Pepsi. He's going to say the caffeine is forbidden. I can't, if he asks for water, then maybe he's going to expect me to, do something. So he's having all these stereotypes of the Brotherhood guy. Meanwhile, the Brotherhood is, I wish I didn't ask him that question. Now he's going to ask me for vodka, and what am I supposed to do? And what ends up happening is they spend 10 minutes not talking, and then they leave. And so at the end it says, what a missed opportunity. And I thought it was a very powerful, again, Egyptian youth making this, saying, what a missed opportunity. Because of this simple question, stereotypes, they never engage in the dialogue, which would have been so important for these two young Egyptian men to have had.
Thank you. So now I'm going to open it up to all of you. We have Renata over here with her microphone, and I just ask that you identify yourself and your organization, and you please, if you have a comment, do add a question on it. We want to see this in the form of a question that the panelists can respond to.
Hi, I'm Steve Engelken. I just a few weeks ago retired from the State Department. So I just a few weeks ago retired from the State Department, so I'm getting my mind around what it's like to be out of government, but I'm still thinking about the problems as I saw them when I was in government. And I have a lot of sympathy with Embassy Cairo. You may recall they issued a statement just before the rioting in an attempt, I'm sure, to try to head this off. To put it mildly, this was not a successful statement. Didn't head off the riot, and it was offensive here at home. It was apologetic about the First Amendment. I recall it said something about abusing freedom of speech or something like that. Because I was once in a situation when Pastor Jones was getting ready with great fanfare to have one of his incidents with the Quran. People came running to me saying the same thing. Here, we should put out a statement. Thank God we didn't. We decided the draft just wouldn't have worked, and it wouldn't have. But what do you recommend governments say when the next time somebody decides to be provocative, and it will happen, and upload something crazy on YouTube? What should we be saying? We have no responsibility for what any kook, I think is a good term, might want to upload onto YouTube. But I'd be curious in what government should be saying. Your advice on that. Thank you.
I think I might have an answer for that. So I think President Obama and Secretary Clinton did an excellent job of responding to the YouTube video by basically not responding to it, saying that they recognized the hateful message that came out of it, but they were moving beyond the video. Like you said, governments don't have a responsibility to comment on every single thing that's uploaded to YouTube or the internet that may be deemed as hateful or offensive to some people. But we were dealing with other issues. We were dealing with the reactions to that. And so I think in this instance, it's probably best for governments to rely on those strong civil society organizations that do have a relationship with communities to put out statements or to work with the community to be like, listen, this is, I understand that, whatever message came out might have been offensive, but this is the way to react or not react, or here is something more appropriate or responsible. Here's some responsible speech to counter that. For example, I know, the ads in New York, they were brought up. The government doesn't have to comment on that. And so what have civil society organizations done? There have been plenty of organizations that have put up counter ads. And in fact, our organization has put up counter ads in the New York subway and here in DC in the bus system. And so I think this is the perfect opportunity where you do see that working relationship between government and organizations to combat, instances like this.
I think this might be a good opportunity to remind that anything that I say is my own personal opinion and not the opinion of the U.S. Institute of Peace. But what I did want to share was that what I hear on the ground, and I think it's important for government officials to understand how it's perceived. I think Hood is 100% right. Perception is reality. And for the majority of people in the Middle East, there's very few who can understand that the government can't get involved. I mean, this is the strongest government in the world. You can't tell someone not to post on YouTube. You can't tell YouTube to stop. I mean, it's impossible for them to understand, especially because they come from governments that are have high censorship. So, just that idea that it's not within government's hands, no one can believe or understand that. I think the second issue is people perceive a double standard. So, often what people will say to me is, but Jazeera is limited. It's not all over satellite channels. It's not allowed on cable. So you can limit Al Jazeera, but you can't limit this. So that's the second statement that I often hear. And I think the third thing is people will always ask me if it was an anti-Semitic message would be accepted in the U.S. And I think, and I agree, the proper way is civil societies. I mean, if you really want for people to understand that dynamic of freedom of speech versus, freedom of religion, there has to be an understanding of what the different roles of government and civil society can be, and a proactive one to really be able to have people begin to appreciate the complexity. But at the end of the day, there is also a responsibility to protect. And I think particularly when you have, with the case of the Quran burnings, I mean, you had U.S. soldiers on the ground. As someone who is on the ground, consistently working with embassy staff, it puts us in danger when these statements come out. And so there is that also kind of very delicate balance of the responsibility to protect your people on the ground if you're involved in these countries and these statements are made.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Sekero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. I'm based here in the district. We focus on conflict resolution and violence prevention. Initially, I'm from Kenya. I had to talk about Western Africa, Arab, I don't know where we belong. But thank you so much, Ms. Madam Ambassador, for your presentation and all your wonderful presentation. Looking at your presentation, I thank Hota and all your presentation. The most lacking, I talked here recently when I said the big organizations don't want to collaborate with small organizations like this, especially when they are funded. When they are on the ground, they know they are from America and the small organizations are there. They don't want to collaborate. That is where the missing link is, because the grassroots people know more on the ground where violence is coming, where problem is coming, especially women who are in the rural area. They know what is happening in that place. So when you avoid them and you don't want to put them on dialogue, how do you expect the message to reach them? Looking at the language barrier, they don't understand English, they don't understand Arabic. How do you convince them that you are saying the right thing, that you're talking about peace? And then I come to Mayor Coppin. All this is caused by poverty-related issues. We need to incorporate into peace problems, violence, empowerment, humanitarian, investment, which will create jobs to avoid problems like violence. The people who act violence are young people, youth. When you stay doing nothing, they are sitting idle, waiting for where, as you say, media like drama, people like drama, where they'll go and do drama. So when they get a chance of getting into the drama, is when they will act. The violence, all those sort of things. Like now, I'm going to do election observation in Kenya. My country, Kenya, had violence in 2007. Where violence, my nephew was among those who were killed. And now I'm one of the election observers. How do we put civil society, religious people, politicians, Madam Ambassador, together to dialogue to prevent violence before election and after election? And why is the violence there before and after election? We need to get together, dialogue before all this happens. So thank you so much for this presentation. How can we collaborate with you all, the big organization, the State Department, the government, because even the politicians, even the Christians have entered into politics. So getting all that done is just a mess unless we dialogue with the grassroots people, community-based organization, or a small organization like mine, and big like the organization like yours, and the government of the United States State Department. Thank you.
Thank you. So the challenge of collaborations between small and rural organizations, international organizations.
I couldn't agree more with the problem you're identifying, and I've mourned over it for a long time in terms of it's very difficult. Governments have huge amounts of money that they have to disperse in very particular ways, and very, very controlled by extreme details of legality that make it almost impossible for anyone of integrity on the ground to be able to handle that. And so this vast difference between governments on the one hand and their legal strictures, and on the other hand, the people who actually are really on the ground, This is one of the big challenges we have in a global community. How do we actually learn? And it's also a shift in psychology, and that is to actually believe that people on the ground, that poor women on the ground, are actually have a higher moral intelligence about violence than think tanks do. Okay? That is a paradigm shift. So part of it is realizing that people that, and we know this scientifically now. We know that, say, from psychology, that there is high forms of intelligence in physics and mathematics, that the same brain can have zero intelligence in social intelligence. That social intelligence, moral intelligence, the capacity to know that everyone in the room has the same right to dignity is not simple for the brain. It's a very developed notion that many illiterate people have and many highly educated people don't. And so that realization of the wisdom at the bottom is vital to the shift in this. Then there's a technical problem, and that is they can't even apply. They don't even know what it is to apply. I've been trying to figure it out for 20 years, and only because of my 30-something colleagues can I figure it out right now. Okay? Otherwise, the money is just taken from people who know how to take money. Their expertise is not peace. Their expertise is not development. Their expertise is taking money. Okay, so this is a built-in problem that every government person has a problem with. And we have to work harder at how to make that connection, how to have that hierarchy of relationships in such a way that there are enablers who speak for those amazing people on the ground. And the second thing is that, like I said before, every institution that you develop in development work, in jobs, has to be not one group over against another. It has to be that those people in those villages see that this is a multi-faith or multi-sectarian or multi-ethnic effort. It is not one group privileged over the other. And that model is the model of the social contract you're looking for. If it's not, it looks like a trick. It looks like one group getting advantages over the other. So it's two things. It's one, on the ground, that it's always this new notion of contracts across ethnic boundaries, but the other one is that we recognizing that we have a problem globally with how to transfer our wealth and our power into the hands of people that really deserve it because of their high moral intelligence, but who don't know how to ask for it and don't know how to get it. We have to work harder at that.
Okay. I completely agree with several points. I mean, one thing is in terms of security, knowing there's a lot of ways of actually preventing. And, you know, one of the first things I do, particularly if I'm staying a long time in a country, is I'll find out who the religious and sometimes tribal leader, because it's important that they know you're there and why you're there. And I lived in Iraq from 2003 to 2005, and thankfully was able to leave before it got very violent. And I was living in one of the most dangerous areas, and it was actually the religious leader who came up to me and said, "Our neighborhood is no longer ours. So, we've never had any problems with you, but I can't guarantee anything moving forward. There are a lot of people coming in, a lot of people we don't recognize in the streets. You might want to think about leaving." And that was actually the time that I left. And then several months later, it became one of the biggest areas where the confrontations happen. And so, knowing the local leadership and understanding that, I think, is very essential. And anyone who's spent time on the ground will acknowledge that. I think that the challenge, and what Mark was describing and what you were alluding to, we call them international darlings. There's international darlings, great at proposal writing, have access to computers. We take that for granted. A lot of the rural areas don't even have electricity, so have access to computers, know how to apply. And I think that the biggest challenge is, how do you get those people involved? And you have to find a way to bridge those groups with the international darlings. You can't ignore one or the other, because you need the people who can actually keep the financial records together. Because even if you go straight into the rural areas and give them funding, A, you can delegitimize them, B, you can create a moral hazard and create corruption, because they might not even be corrupt, they just don't know how to handle the money. And so there is a lot of technical issues. One of the things that we try to do through our grants program at USIP is we actually work with people before they ever write the proposal. So they can put in a concept note. We'll work back and forth. We'll help develop the proposals. We travel to the area where we meet with potential grantees. And there's a relationship ever before the proposal is ever submitted. But that takes an overwhelming amount of overhead. So for a very small amount of funds, because the absorption capacity of the organizations you're talking about are about $10,000 to $15,000, maybe up to $25,000. We're used to, donors are used to millions of dollars, maybe $250,000, maybe $100,000 is considered a small grants program. When you're talking about organizations who can only absorb 10 to 15, you have a disconnect. So it's a paradigm shift of understanding, but it's also a huge logistical and administrative challenge. And I think that the way around it is networks, is helping build regional networks who can then take the large funds and find ways of dispersing them. But that in itself has challenges of its own and is technically difficult. But that's what we're exploring more of doing, is how to have regional networks who can take the large money from governments and then filter it down. Just one issue on poverty, I think, especially when we're looking at religious extremism. I agree with you in most of the cases, but there is a large number of middle class to people who, the Gulf is a great way to, burst the myth of just poverty. In terms of religious extremism, a lot of it does come from Gulf countries who are considered wealthy and who come from very wealthy families. So it's not the only link. And I think particularly with religious extremism, there is an ideology there. There is, an exploitation of people's viewpoints. And again, I think the dignity and humiliation aspect of it is a big part of it. And so when we're looking at the analysis, I think we just need to be careful not to only look at poverty and socioeconomic. There is another element that is based on ideology, the right to be heard, which is a basic right, and again, the issue of humiliation and the right to dignity.
I just want to underscore two other things you said, and again, I'm breaking my role here as moderator, so I apologize. But two things. One, a lot of the international darlings that are in the capitals of these conflicts that we work in, or countries that we work in, are often from the secular peace-building world. So some of the challenge with not engaging with the religious sector by international organizations is also because the faith-based organizations or the religious peace-building organizations might not be as sophisticated when it comes to proposal writing or to having the relationships already with the international organizations, and that creates the challenge. But also with this issue of engagement with women, this becomes a challenge also for religious peace building, because oftentimes when international organizations or governments want to engage the religious sector, they go straight for the clerics. They go straight for the institutional religious authorities, which in most of the world is primarily vested in men. And so part of the work of the religious peace building field has been pushing governments and international organizations to think of religious leadership and religious authority as outside of clerical authority, because we know that women in much of the world, especially in these rural areas, play a very significant role in shaping religious interpretations, in shaping religious and moral responses to violence and to other communities, in shaping religious behavior and so on. So we need to be thinking about the hermeneutical or the interpretive power and authority that many different religious actors have, not just clerical authorities. So let's open it to more questions.
Hi, I'm Neil with Department of State. And following up on what you're saying about women, I think most of us would recognize the important, vital resource women bring to the table. But can you discuss logistically how, particularly in the Muslim world, how we can reach these women of faith to make them part, not just of a discussion on the side, but absolutely the decision-making process?
So it's actually not as difficult as one may think. Women in Muslim majority countries, we tend to think of them as being illiterate or uneducated, and in some rural areas that's the case. But take Egypt for example. You have a lot of women who are entering the universities, and in some cases outnumber men in these universities. So it's just being aware of making sure to include all these different voices at the table when you are discussing these issues, especially when it comes to religious freedom. And when you talk about religious freedom within certain contexts, let's say the Arab world or Muslim majority countries, then you want to come at it from an organic perspective. What is it that their faith teaches them? So let's talk about Islam. What sort of ideals are promoted within Islam that allow women to be educated, to have a voice, to be part of the discussion, and to be part of the decision-making process? I think the general idea, maybe from people in Western countries, is that it is difficult finding women who would be part of these discussions, but it's just getting out there and engaging them. They are there, they're willing to be engaged, they want to be part of the discussion, they want to be part of the decision-making process. They're in parliament, they're in universities, they're working women, but it's just giving them that chance.
I mean, I think that when you're talking about decision makers, there's going to have to be institutionalized change, and that's going to take a long time to do that. And I think that if you look, for example, at the case of Morocco, where they were actually able to create an ulama program for women, because, you know, I agree with Huda completely. You can find women who are engaged, and you'll find women who are well-schooled, but they're not decision makers, and particularly when it comes to religious authority. And it's a rich tradition that once existed but was lost. And I think that what you're having is a need for institutionalized change so that you can actually have ulama. I know that, you know, for example, I think the Asia Foundation is now looking at taking a group of Afghan women to study at Al-Azhar. So, you know, having that actual traditional teaching and then looking at changing the institutions where they're then having the authority, I think is very necessary, because no matter how well schooled, and I can tell you, you know, I know a lot of the stories about how women in Islam are supposed to be participating and all of that, but if I'm standing in front of a room and an ulama stands in front of the room and contradicts me, who are they going to believe? And in most cases, when I've gone into Yemen or in Iraq, I'll tell women, you know, some women will tell me it's forbidden in Islam for us to work, and of course we know that's not true, and so I'll say no, it's not, and this is what the Quran says, so this is what the Hadith says, and they think it's cute. When I go to the religious leader and come back with the fatwa, then they'll listen. And so, you know, that's the decision maker is still a challenge, and it has to happen institutionally. And I think the best case scenario so far has been Morocco.
Hi, my name is Anshuman Apte, and I am representing Voice of America Afghanistan Service. My question is to each of you, and including, you know, if Ambassador would like to comment on this as well. My question is, oftentimes US geopolitical considerations clash with that of the other nations, and often religion and religious groups become the tool. You know, we have seen that happening in Afghanistan in 80s, where, you know, religious groups were supported or opposed by the, you know, different sides for their own political, geopolitical agendas. How do you think, looking ahead, the US government can basically work to change this? I mean, both the sides, US government as well as the opposing governments. How do they balance their geopolitical considerations with the religion?
I've done a lot of thinking about that and work on that for the last 20 years, and it's really an excellent question. And I do believe that we need, there's much unfinished business from the Cold War. The Cold War is still devastating our planet, and people don't realize it in terms of the consequences for Syria and other things. And I think that this, the uses of religion in the Cold War, in particular, and the consequences in terms of how these proxy wars took place is still haunting us. So the next step, from a logical point of view, is something, again, that the Western nations have a hard time considering, because religion is officially not on the agenda. But there needs to be a hands-off peace treaty on religion. In other words, the instrumentalization of religion for the sake of military or political gain is a standard operating procedure for many states to this day. Now, the only way that we've resolved these kind of interest-based conflicts on the global scale is at the United Nations, with people negotiating on the places in which they're doing things destructive in Bosnia, and how can we do something constructive in Bosnia? We're doing something destructive in the Middle East, how can we do something constructive? And so one of those is hands-off of Christianity, hands off of Sunni Islam, hands off of Shiite Islam as a tool of warfare, hands off of you know, Wahhabist groups or militant groups, and that's not an easy that's not easy, and it's very tempting that now the genie's out of the bottle with some radical group you don't like, to form your own group. Say, okay, these are the moderates who believe in human rights, and immediately you're just seen as instrumentalizing them too. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So it's not, you know, and this is, we're facing this now with American-Egyptian relations. What, you know, what is the relationship now with the Muslim Brotherhood and with the government and with civil society groups, etc. So I think this is front and center on how states and how even allies, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all of these groups, what is the attitude now to the uses of religion, and how can we have a treaty or a set of understandings on how to depoliticize the engagement with religious groups and religious communities? And I think the more that becomes a self-conscious process, the more that we will allow local imams and others to work out their own problems rather than being instrumentalized. And that's the best we can do. And I know I have been working in Afghanistan, and it is an extremely difficult process of how you build that kind of trust, and that trust not to be that the local people believe that you're not there to instrumentalize them. I'll never forget a moment we were in the room with them for the first time with many imams, and they said, "Okay, what do you want the conference to be about?" So we turned to them and said, "What do you want it to be about?" So they were in state of shock because no funder had ever done that. So you see what I'm saying? I mean, the idea, empowerment is so simple from a psychological point of view, but like I said, it's a form of intelligence that's not always available to international actors. And so that notion of handing over the power and saying, "What do you want?" that simple notion is already creating that trust that the religion is not being instrumentalized.
So, yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with everything that Mark said. I think it's really important for governments to realize that now they shouldn't be afraid to engage different kinds of groups. And when it comes to, faith-based groups, now more than ever, we're seeing their prominence and their value to adding their voice to the conversation. And we at MPAC, we like to say, if you're not sitting at the table, then you're on the menu. Nobody wants to be on the menu. And so you want to include all these voices. They do have, they have things to say, and they're on the ground, so they know what sort of ideas, what sort of comments, what is happening on the ground better than the government from the top does. And so it's really important to include these kind of groups. Just like Mark said, we shouldn't be afraid right now, especially, talking more specifically about Egypt, U.S. relations, this sort of pushback or, welcoming with open arms of the Muslim Brotherhood or whoever is going to be in power. You need to be able to adjust sort of policies with groups that are coming into power.
Can I request a comment from Madam Ambassador? And please face my camera, ma'am.
It would be my delight. I think Mark hit it very well, that it is very complex. In terms of going forward, many of the governmental actors have to be at the table. It's, conversations with the Secretary, Department of Defense. But I think one of the critical things that Mark said, two things. One is that our strategic dialogue is beginning the conversations to make sure that everyone's at the table. Faith leaders and civil society are at the table, and that's beginning a conversation that has not happened before. I think also from his comment earlier when he said that sometimes our presence, learning to be in a posture of just listening, and I think that's the paradigm that's starting to shift. That particularly, I can speak for myself as I go, and having been a former faith leader, and now in government, I think the presence, many times is welcome, and people do want us to be in a listening posture. And the third thing I will say is that, it's very complex that we go forward, but I think what Hoda shared now is that faith leaders are at the table. I just left the United Nations this past week, and I met with several NGO groups who are religious actors. When we were at UN General Assembly, the room was standing room only in terms of putting religion on the table in terms of conversation. I made several interventions with Jordan and Italy and Senegal. So I believe that the conversation has begun. And so I think that the first step in terms of going forward is doing what we're doing today and beginning to really, really put religion and government and politics on the table. So the conversation has begun. We are planting seeds for the future, but I think we've made a lot of headway with our strategic dialogue, and I would hope at some point this panel and I can actually travel together, so it's not just a government Chip, you know, we have codels where government goes with Congress, where our State Department might go with Congress. But I think at some point in the future, we might want to go together as civil society and government and begin to really show a paradigm that has not been done before. So we're on our way.
Thanks for the invitation.
Did you get the good shot?
Family
Okay.
vacation. We have a lot of questions here, and time is quickly marching on. So, Renata, I'm going to ask you to run around a little bit. You might want to be in the center aisle here, so we can capture the last of these questions and then try to answer them all before we leave at noon.
Kyle Ballard from the State Department. I'll make it really quick. One of the elements I think is somewhat lacking from the discussion, primarily because it was framed a certain way. So we were talking about the U.S. government and then civil society, but didn't talk much about the behavior of the other governments in these so-called, you know, for lack of a better term, target countries, so to speak. And going on kind of the traditional diplomacy line and how important that still remains, we as the U.S. government have to publicly and forcefully go out and really put out our red lines and define our interests in order to engage with these governments as partners. And I know that there are many complications of that. You know, Congress and public opinion here in the United States is one where it really requires us to define those interests very publicly. Where does that conflict with our approach and our emerging approach with empowering civil societies? And how can we do a better job of traditional diplomacy while enacting this new approach and this hybrid? Because the host governments are the ones who really need to carve out space, and what can we do as a U.S. government to push those other governments to carve out the space for civil society to do what they need to do?
While Renata's going to the next person in the audience, I'm going to throw out a question from Twitter as well to add to our list. One person asked a question that I think we've kind of been addressing in the last comments, but it's this question of, in the past we thought of having the secular approach and the secular language, secular paradigms as being necessarily inclusive language, but we were increasingly learning that using the secular approach actually excludes or marginalizes particular voices and particular groups. So how, and this question was not about government approaches, but rather peace-building approaches by different peace-building organizations. How can we include different religious understandings of peace-building, but in a way that's still going to be inclusive of many different religious communities and many different groups? So next question from the audience.
My name is David Steele. I'm adjunct faculty at Brandeis University, program on conflict and coexistence, and independent consultant in various peace work around the world for a number of years. And I really want to have a question about the practicality of dialogue, which I do a lot of attempts at, when you're dealing with tremendous values differences. And you know, you talked about a common definition of religious freedom, for example, but it's obvious that there isn't one at the moment around the world. Talk about social contracts, which I think are extremely important, often have to be worked out very locally. Talking about a global community, how do you begin to do that? Not sure the UN is a good example. So my real question is, when you come down to dealing with conflicts of values as they're experienced by people, how do you begin to approach that question realistically?
Hi, my name is Suzan Taylor, and I'm with the National Office of the Church of Scientology. And I want to thank you all for your comments today. We've been talking a lot about dialogue and you know, having the tools with which to bring people together. And I was just wondering what role the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights might be able to play at, say, at a grassroots level in bringing people together.
Thanks. My name is Johann Legner, and I'm a German journalist. And I just add on something to the question of the gentleman here. Mark mentioned that we have, even inside the Western community, very different interpretations, for example, of the freedom of expression. For me, as a European, it's interesting to see that in this country, you can expose a swastika, but certain forms of nudity are punished because they are illegal. It seems for me just crazy. in a certain way, what you are doing here. Listening to you 2 hours, I didn't get one idea how the American society is able itself to think about changing itself by demanding the rest of the world to think about a lot of things, you know. Your interpretation of the First Amendment is discussable, and many people, even in Europe, would say, please start a debate about your interpretation of your constitution before you come up with giving advice to all the rest of the world. What I always miss in this discussion, as a European, and then think about how an Arab or Turkish person or whatever, wherever in the world would feel this, that you don't question yourself.
You guys are funny. Okay. Well, I'll begin with the first question last. I actually asked Susie before we began about whether the emphasis was going to be some of the global issues, because this was provoked by the film that then ended up in the tragedy in Benghazi. And so the focus was on some global questions. And one of the challenges of every society, I told you before, I worked with the Swiss ambassador in this terrible situation in Syria. There are many things I could have talked to him about. Is what's wrong with Switzerland about in the domestic policy about X, Y, and Z, and how is it possible women didn't get the vote until 1970 something, etc. Well, he wasn't the issue. It wasn't his problem. He and I were together in a difficult situation, a life-threatening situation, and we were both committed to the value of everyone's human life. We weren't speaking for our societies. In other words, we face a globalized community of people who are trying to do good, and they don't represent at every moment everything that's going on in their society. And that's a subculture on a global scale of people advocating human rights, people advocating women's empowerment, people advocating conflict resolution. So if you say to me that American officials are not self-examined enough, if you say that to me, I'll say it to you that it's true of all officials in the world, and that the hardest thing in the world is for societies to officially self-examine. That is it's an exception when Australia has a National Sorry Day, after years and years and years of civil society helping people get used to the idea of apologizing to indigenous people. So what happens here in terms of freedom of speech, allowing for a swastika but not for a nude picture, that is a result of a struggle of social contract that's peculiar to this country and its peculiarities. Every country has its peculiarities. Should we be self-examined? Absolutely. Absolutely. Should that prevent people from sharing globally on how to advance human rights and women's rights? No, it shouldn't. But are you telling me that officials tend to be arrogant or tend to tell other people what to do? Yes, of course. That happens all the time. But there's a real struggle that I've experienced within officials, European officials, American officials. Some are excellent at not coming off that way. People like the ambassador to Libya of blessed memory. So there are great variations in the capacity of diplomacy of officials. If you feel in frustration with American power in the world and massive military-industrial complex and sales, well, everybody in the world is frustrated by how much power the West throws around, how much we're supporting both sides. We talk about peace in Iran, but we're providing submarines to one side, and Germany is too, yes. It's providing the chemical warfare and the submarines, and everybody's benefiting in the West from their power, and there's a lot to self-examine about that. I'm in violence research now, and I'm fascinated by violence research. The big flaw in violence research is that they talk about 6 per 100,000 deaths in the United States, and that's high, and it's only 1 per 100,000 in Germany. But it doesn't talk about all the deaths we cause by our military-industrial complexes. That's not included in the stats. All the violence is over in Africa. No. So self-examination is absolutely critical to our work. But that should not prevent us from struggling for a globe in which everyone is struggling with the question of freedom of religion. Everyone is struggling with the question of freedom of speech. And I have deep faith that the more that we provoke these discussions globally, and the more honest we are about our own peculiarities, the more that everybody's going to come up with their own interesting innovations on how to manage that. And we'll all be better off for it. So I respect your frustration with the public image in the United States, but I also say that there's many good people who are trying to do something different. As far as the conflict of values, David, and David is a wonderful activist and innovator, is the simplest thing has been focusing on the positive. You don't ask people what their differences are. You ask people, what do you think you share with them? What do you think, what do you think they want for their children? What do you think they want in terms of jobs? What do you want? In other words, positive peace building I found is a remarkable shift of the brain capacity. And I always take it back to that. Many, many rooms I've sat in Palestine and Syria and Israel, and everybody's, it used to be Ireland. Everything's focused on what can't work. And then you say, well, what do you want to see here in 5 years? And suddenly the brain gets all crazy. So I don't know, I didn't think about that. And it's very intelligent people, because when you have trouble, and we all have troubles in our lives, all you can think about is the trouble, until somebody says to me, well, what do you want? And then suddenly your brain does something different, and your heart does something different. So we have to be ambassadors of that process. Last night I was very proud of my presentation in Washington Theological Union, and somebody asked a question. Everybody was really thrilled with all this peace work and global work, and somebody asked a question right in the middle and said, because I was talking about women's empowerment is changing everything and making the world far less violent than it's ever been in history, and that's absolutely true. And he said to me, very pointedly, he said, yeah, but if you think it's less violent, how do you respond to what do you think about the voice of the unborn? And his direct question and challenge is that all of this liberation of women has led to the deaths of millions of unborn, right? So I was stunned, but but then I said, that's very important, because that would take a very deep conversation between your care for the unborn and other people's belief that the liberation of women has been the key to the nonviolence. And we're both talking about how to celebrate life. Let's think about how we can celebrate life together and work on that. Because his passion was life, a different interpretation. So you really have to work your brain at how to refocus. And I've seen this work in many, many bad situations. That's it.
So to the question of self-examination, I think a lot of these issues that have been happening globally recently have led to an internal self-examination here in the United States. I'm not sure. I think we may have a negative public perception worldwide that we have this American exceptionalism and we can go out and give advice, but we don't take our own advice. But I think it would be unfair to say that we don't self-analyze, a lot of the policies that we have going on. I mean, we have debates every day on freedom of expression. Even with that trailer, the YouTube trailer that came out, caused a lot of debates and discussion, people saying, well, what's the difference between free speech and hate speech? So I don't think that it would be fair to say that we are completely devoid of self-examining a lot of our policies and our own freedoms and bills in the Constitution. And when it comes to shared values, I think Mark totally hit the nail on the head. We have a lot more in common, I think, than we actually think. At the end of the day, we're all humans, and we do strive to have the same things: security, bringing our children into a safe world, education, empowerment for all, or just at the end of the day, having our own voice heard. So I think focusing on the positive aspects of our shared values is much more important than trying to build policies on what we don't have in common.
I'll start with, I think, the gentleman's question from state about how to get the countries or what we call the duty bearers, the countries in to actually shift. And I think that it's important for our foreign policy, or when we're addressing nations, to understand what their capacity is, what they're actually capable of. And I say that because, for example, in Libya, most people agree exactly with the recommendations that the U.S. or other people are asking for. It comes down to a capacity issue, particularly with the militias, particularly with protection. A lot of times we'll ask governments, control, the speech or deal with religious extremism when they simply don't have that authority. So I think the question, and this is where the combination of civil society and government comes into place, and particularly with the issues we're addressing here, the most important question is who has the moral legitimacy, who has the moral authority to make change. In almost all cases, particularly with the transitional governments, they simply don't have it. Even if they do have it, they don't have the capacity. And I think that's one of the trickiest issues. But again, it goes back to focusing on principles. This is what we would like to see. For example, with a lot of the recognition of the opposition when the dictatorships were still in country, the U.S. was very clear. We accept you, but based on certain principles that we accept you to adhere to. And both the population, the people on the streets, and the region are expecting the U.S. to hold up to that. So when it comes to religion freedom, when it comes to women, when it comes to minorities, I think we have to be non-compromising on the principles, but also be very flexible and open to the approaches and the timeline. Most importantly is the timeline. We're managing expectations in country. I think there also needs to be managing expectations of what the international community want these governments, a lot of them are transition governments, to do, so that we're not actually disempowering them and setting them up for failure. On the Twitter question in terms of secular language, what a lot of people in the Middle East talk about is secular fundamentalism. And I think that's what people are objecting to. And I was told by some of the sheikhs that I worked with that were from Afghanistan, they're saying even, secular translates to baladin, no religion. So, understanding or readopting or creating a new word or taking back the word secular is part of the debate that needs to happen. Because right now, secular is understood as no religion. It's not and I think that there needs to be a broader conversation where it can be inclusive, where you can bring in religion, where I think Mark's point about the rule of law with the rule of religious law, those debates can take place, but there is, I think, a need to understand that a new term or new terminology needs to be negotiated and used, so that you're not just restricting to religion, because at the same time when you enter into that debate there is a danger, because you're putting religion, and it's very hard to argue with the Word of God versus everything else. So how do you intertwine all of that to create a new dialogue or a new term? But the word secular and secular fundamentalism is what's primarily being rejected. The question about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think, is a really good question. And I think that it goes down to the idea of what I was saying before about not just concepts. I mean, few people will pull apart the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When there is reservations, it tends to be reservations on the freedom of religion aspect for the reasons I explained before. But underlying is the mistrust. It goes a little bit back to what Mark was saying about the need for a new social contract or an understanding of the relationship. People feel there's a double standard when it comes to the UN, Declaration of Human Rights. Human rights, democracy is called on when there are certain political agendas or the political will, and completely ignored in other aspects. And so people feel unless the document is truly universal and therefore universally applied, we don't acknowledge it. We don't acknowledge it as a strong term, but it's not owned. There isn't an ownership over it. So I think that that's really a big, larger question, is how can we address this perception or reality, depending on who you talk to, of double standards when we want to call on human rights and when we want to turn the other way and not acknowledge it. I think finally, the question of different values and self-assessment, I mean, that was the point that I was trying to bring when I said we need to look at extremisms from within. I think that that is something that, for legitimacy reasons, not only for addressing our domestic issues, but even for legitimacy overseas, people want to see that debate. So how can we take it? And I think it is taking place, but how can we take it to a larger audience? But, whereas I agree with my colleagues about the start, David, this is in relation to your question about the values and the differences, there are essential differences. And, even for me within, the internal Islamic dynamic, I sit and I struggle during conversations because there are things that I just will not be able to accept. And I think that it's important that we have these conversations, but my fear has always been we have conversations where let's all hold hands so no one can hold a gun, and we don't get to the difficult conversations. We have to build the trust to get to the difficult conversations, and that's extremely essential. Otherwise, change will not happen. And I think one of the ways I do it is focusing on, in Islam, there's something called adab al-ikhtilaf, the rules of engagement for disagreement. So the understanding from the beginning is we're going to have disagreement. We're not going to agree. The way you see women's rights, I see differently, and we both have Islamic arguments. Let's compare notes. And here's what Islam says about disagreement. So setting that expectation up from the beginning and using, rather than Robert's Rule of Conduct or Chatham House rules, using an Islamic framework for the disagreement allows people to understand we're going to talk about disagreements. We're not going to just talk about common ground, but we're going to do it respectfully. And the value really is, and you see it, particularly when you kind of isolate people in some type of retreat over a couple of days, you actually see people shift and begin to understand the other person's perspective. And that's extremely powerful because people really do believe and assume you're out to get me. You hate me. This is an age-old conflict. No matter what I say, you won't be convinced. But when they're able to actually see the perspective, understand the, argument, but also see the fear. So, again, within Islamic issues on women's rights, a lot of women, a lot of the secular women aren't just being difficult or hate religion. They're afraid of the rights that they feel will be taken away from them. It's a fear that mothers have experienced and they've instilled in their daughters. And they'll say it. We don't want to be a Saudi Arabia. We don't want to be in Iran. This is their words, not my judgment on either country. And likewise, the women who are practicing will say, well, we don't want to be a France and we don't want to be a Turkey in the beginning. Again, not my words, their words. And so there's a fear. There's a legitimate fear of saying we don't want to experience what we've seen happen when religion is brought in or when secular fundamentalism is brought in. And that automatically breaks down where they're not agreeing with each other, but they're actually understanding each other's perspective. I had one woman in most Muslim countries, or most Arab countries, I don't know about the larger Muslim world, but most Arab countries, rape is not a crime if the man marries the victim. And so this is horrendous. And for me, how can this be justified? And when one woman was able to stand up and actually justify it, no one agreed with her, but for the first time, people weren't like, you're so crazy, you're ignorant, and you're a violent woman who's been brainwashed. They actually understood her issue to the point where then they were able to build an argument to counter it, which was acceptable to her. She understood that you're talking about trauma on top of trauma, so you're actually not helping anyone. And we were able to draft a new language for the criminal law. But that could only happen by going beyond arguing, and rather than just, going crazy when she's defending the law, understanding her perspective, then you're actually able to come out with conclusions. But it's a very difficult process. I can't tell you how many times I've sit in a room and I'm extremely uncomfortable. And I'm not even talking about interfaith. I'm talking about intra discussions. I'm extremely uncomfortable, but force myself to listen and understand different perspectives and actually end up learning a lot.
We've gone over our time, so I need to draw this to a close, but I think you'll probably be able to capture our presenters for a few minutes after this, after we wrap up here. But I want to thank all of you for coming and participating in this rich discussion, including those who are streaming it over the internet. I want to thank particularly the Ambassador and the Office of International Religious Freedom for co-sponsoring us and encouraging us to hold this panel in cooperation with them. And I want to thank all of my presenters for giving such nuanced and fruitful comments on the topic. So thank you very much. Hope to see you again at the Institute.